So last week, nerds throughout the world rejoiced when it was announced that Warner Brothers was releasing a Lord of the Rings anime. Wait a second, isn't there already a Lord of the Rings animated movie? Hello everyone, I'm Finn. Welcome back to finnfilms. Join me today as we are discussing the upcoming Lord of the Rings anime. The Lord of the Rings animated movie, The War of the Rohirrim. So like every other D&D loving, anime watching, fantasy book enjoying nerd, I absolutely love Lord of the Rings. I mean, Lord of the Rings, it's like by far the most influential fantasy series basically ever, and essentially Lord of the Rings established and inspired and created a lot of like the many fantasy tropes that we see across the fantasy genre today. However, for as good as the book series itself is, the Lord of the Rings media as a whole has been, well, it's been kind of hit and miss throughout the many years. First, there was the 1977 animated film, The Hobbit, which was then followed up a year later by the animated film, The Lord of the Rings, and then 2 years later by the animated film, Return of the King. My family actually owned the VHS tape for the animated Lord of the Rings movie, and I remember watching it like a ton as a kid. I absolutely watched it on repeat as a kid. And while these animated films themselves are kind of like cult classics in a way, I wouldn't really necessarily call them good, and they don't really hold up like 40, 50 years later. However, 21 years later in 2001, Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring would drop, and man, did this movie change everything. Obviously, the Peter Jackson, like, Lord of the Rings movie trilogy series is, like, really the iconic, like, Lord of the Rings, like, movies and media that everyone knows today. Almost everyone has seen, like, at least one of these movies, and these movies as a whole really did so much for the film industry as a whole, and specifically the use of, like, CGI in, like, movies and film. I mean, it still amazes me to this day that these movies were made in, like, the early 2000s, because man, do they still hold up in 2024. This trilogy is like the peak of like Lord of the Rings media. The fact that they actually managed to capture like Tolkien's grand narrative adventure creation in a live action movie on the big screen, to me is like still extremely astounding. I mean, in the media landscape in like today's day and age with like massive streaming companies with absolutely huge budgets making series like Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, it does seem kind of trivial to be like able to bring such a grand fantasy adventure tale like Lord of the Rings on to the big screen in a live action series, but really the making of this original Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson, this movie series really did change Hollywood as a whole and really what people kind of thought was possible in cinema. While yes, it did take them like over 11 hours of runtime to actually do it, the sheer fact that they were able to make these movies in the early 2000s and the fact that they turned out as well as they did, to me is still absolutely insane. 9 years after the release of Return of the King, Peter Jackson decided to give it another go. He decided to hop on the old bicycle once again to make the Hobbit trilogy series, and this did not go as well. Don't get me wrong, the Hobbit movies like aren't bad. The second movie of the trilogy series to me is probably my favorite, but they definitely didn't live up to the kind of lofty heights of the first like Lord of the Rings trilogy series, and I think that this really kind of bears out in the movie's ratings. From here, massive streaming shows like Game of Thrones would absolutely change the media landscape as a whole, so Amazon Prime decided that they wanted to get in on this like new high budget like fantasy streaming trend by making Lord of the Rings, Ring of Power. Two, well, kind of mixed results. Once again, we can see this bear out in the splitting of the ratings, with season 1 of this show receiving a 83% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is pretty good, but then if you compare it in contrast with the popcorn meter, it's a 38%. So it seems like critics seem to love this show, while the general kind of fan base, general average show enjoyer did not. Ring of Power is a really confusing show to me. There is a lot of things that I do like and enjoy about it, but there's also a lot of things that I didn't really like about it. You can definitely tell that they absolutely broke the bank when they made this show. I mean, the production of it visually does look amazing, and it has like the massive budget of Amazon behind it, but at times the show and the story do feel a bit soulless to me. Now, though, we come to 2024 with the announcement that this winter, Warner Brothers will be releasing a Lord of the Rings anime, with Peter Jackson returning as the producer for the series, to some fans' dismay. Now, I say that it is a Lord of the Rings anime because it is being led by the Japanese director Kinji Kamiyama, who is probably most famous for working on anime like Jinro, Ghost in the Shell, Star Wars Visions, as well as working as a background artist for one of my favorite anime of all time, Akira. As well, the animation studio for this movie, War of the Rohirrim, is Sola Digital Arts, a Japanese animation studio who has worked with Kamiyama on Ghost in the Shell, as well as being the animation studio behind Rick and Morty, the anime. So while yes, this show will be in English, the animation style is very much Japanese, and so far from the trailer, animation-wise, visually-wise, it looks like it's gonna be pretty freaking sick. However, I'm still a little bit on the fence on if this Lord of the Rings anime movie is actually going to be good, or if it could potentially flop. So War of the Rohirrim tells the story of the people of Rohirrim. They're the horse guides for all of my non-Lord of the Rings nerds. The story being set 183 years before the events of the Lord of the Rings series, and it tells the story of Helm Hammerhead, the king of Rohan at the time, who fought a grand war to defend their land, the land of Rohan, against the Dunlendings. The Dunlendings being a group of wild men who lived in this area and who have a kind of historical grievance against the people of Rohan and their king. Now, I think that this is a pretty interesting idea for like the Lord of the Rings anime. As well, the story will very much kind of differ generally from like the tone of much of the other Lord of the Rings works of media that we've seen so far. In a lot of ways, the choice to do this story in the game, in the Lord of the Rings universe, kind of reminds me of the choice to adapt Fire and Blood into House of the Dragon for a Game of Thrones comparison. Basically, they took a story that Tolkien really only mentions kind of briefly in the appendices of Lord of the Rings, and then they expand upon it greatly in the animated film. Because Tolkien really doesn't go into like crazy detail over the events of the War of the Rohirrim in his novels, it doesn't allow the story writers to make a lot of like much more kind of unique creative like story liberty changes to this story, instead of really trying to adapt an already like told story one to one. As far as how actually good it will be, who really knows? It's kind of impossible to know at this point. From the trailers, it does look like visually at the very least, it will be pretty dope. I mean, this is really the benefit of like using animation as a medium, as you can really do so many like cool, crazy things, and it's so much easier in animation compared to trying to doing it live action with like CGI. And I think that as far as sci-fi and like fantasy series go as like a genre, both of these series really do lend themselves to animation as a medium. I mean, just take a look at like Star Wars Visions or something like Legends of Vox Machina, really, to see just like how well animation works when you're trying to tell kind of a grand, larger than life story. Right now, I'm kind of tentatively positive on this movie, and I think that it might actually end up being pretty good. Irregardless though, if it ends up being good or flopping, I am glad that like animation, and specifically like Japanese style animation, is really becoming way more popular, it seems, with kind of like mainstream Western media and production companies and IPs. For example, again, with the likes of Star Wars Visions, Rick and Morty the anime, the Castlevania animated series, and now the War of the Rohirrim. I mentioned this in another video I put out recently, specifically the video about like what is happening with the planned Name of the Wind show that doesn't seem like it's ever going to come out. But I think that doing the Name of the Wind, the fantasy book series, into an animated adaptation, I think would really work well for that series. But that's probably not going to happen, but it is nice to dream, and it's also nice to see like kind of more adult animated works of media start to become way more prominent and popular in the West in the United States. It really does seem to me like the dramatic rise of anime in popularity over the last like 10 years across the world has really made a lot of showrunners and like production companies kind of turn their heads and be like, damn, you know, we could probably do that too. So far, I will say that I am cautiously positive on the Lord of the Rings anime, the War of the Rohirrim, and I think at the very least, like the animation and the art for this movie should be pretty damn good. If the trailer is anything to go on, I almost guarantee that the battle fight sequences in this animated movie will be sick, but as far as if it's gonna flop or not, I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see and find out. If you guys did enjoy this video, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, as that is the easiest way to help support me, and it really does help support the channel and put this video into the algorithm. Let me know in the comment section down below what your thoughts are on the War of the Rohirrim anime. Do you think it's gonna flop? Do you think it's gonna be sick? Or are you just glad that you get more Lord of the Rings content? If you did enjoy this video, guys, then why don't you check out some of my other content on screen now. As always, thank you once again for continuing to support me. I hope to see you in the next video. Stay safe out there. Until next time, peace, love, Adu.